Once the switch is powered up and we're at the switch prompt, let's talk about the basics for navigating the iOS on a Cisco switch. Now, much of this we talked about before in the previous video in this chapter, so we'll go through this pretty quickly. We will also show the common commands for verifying many of the operations and configuration on the switch. Let's get started. So in our presentation, we talked about the two main exec modes. There is the user mode and there is the privilege mode. When you access the switch or the router initially, you're placed into the user mode, which will reflect the host name of that device, followed by the greater than symbol. Now for default configurations or for switches, the host name will be switch. So this can be changed via configuration. Now at the user mode, we have very limited functionality. So what we could do is, let's kind of scroll down a little bit. We can type in question mark to see what commands we can type in, which is very limited. Things like disable, enable, which will place us into the privilege mode for the switch, and things like ping, among others. So to go to the privilege mode, we type in enable. Now usually a password will be configured. So if that is configured, we need to input the correct password before getting access into the privilege mode. Here we have more commands that we can use. So typing in question mark, you'll see more commands, one of them being configure, that will place us into the configuration mode on the switch. To go back to the user mode, we can type in disable. And once again, to go back to the privilege mode, we type in enable. But let's talk about a couple of shortcuts here. So there's a couple of things in how we could type in commands on Cisco iOS. One, we do not need to type in the entire command. We could type in like a few characters and then press enter, like enable. So before we could type in the entire command, that will work, or we can type in en and press enter. That will also work. We also have the option where we can type in part of the command, like en, press question mark to see what commands match what we typed in so far. So doing that, only enable comes up as a potential command that matches what we typed in so far. And a third thing that we can do is we can type in or press the tab key that can complete what we typed in so far. So we don't need to type in enable. I can type in en, press the tab key, and it will complete the command automatically for us. Let's run through a couple of show commands that we talked about in a previous video. One of those being show version, which will provide information on the switch itself. Some of these details include looking at the iOS version on the switch, including the feature set, that this switch is running the Advanced IP Services feature set. We see the actual host name followed by the uptime for the actual switch itself. We see the actual file name for that iOS image located in the flash memory. Scrolling down further here, you see details of, let's say, the model number, the amount of DRAM memory, and even the interfaces that exist on the switch. So very good information for looking at the details of our 3750 switch. Another command that we could type in on the switch to view a summary of all interfaces is show IP interface brief. This will show all interfaces on our switch, followed by if an IP is assigned and the status, which should be in an up status to be operational. So this is a good command to verify all interfaces on a switch. Or we can be very specific and we can do show interfaces, and that will look at all these interfaces in terms of more detail. So for example, it goes through VLAN 1 then to all of the physical ports on the switch, where we can see the IP that could be assigned, the MAC address, the input output data rates represented in bits per second and packets per second, including errors, input errors, and output errors. And we see that for all interfaces on our switch. So very good for troubleshooting potential issues. Another command we could type in is show run, the running config, where we can look at the active running configuration on our switch, located in the DRAM. We see details on the VLANs configured, the interfaces, and much more. Another command is show VLAN, where we can look at the VLAN table of all VLANs added to our switch. You'll see the VLAN ID, followed by the actual name of that VLAN, and the ports that are associated to that VLAN. Now by default, if no interface has been defined to a VLAN, it will assign it to VLAN 1, the default behavior. So let's get out of here and let's do one more command, and that will be show startup config. This is the permanent configuration that exists in the NVRAM. So nothing here is present because nothing has been configured yet and then saved into the startup config. So when the switch is powered off and we have a configuration that has been saved, everything in the DRAM will be flushed out, but the config file from the NVRAM will be copied into the DRAM to become active. So as you can tell, very similar operations that we talked about with a Cisco router. Let's now start configuring our Cisco switch through the CLI, the command line interface. We will configure an IP address on the VLAN 1 interface that we can use to manage the switch if needed. We'll also configure the default gateway, a username, a password, the enable password, and starting to prepare to configure for port security. So let's go to our configuration mode, and then first under our VLAN 1 interface, we will configure an IP address, the subnet mask, and to bring it up. So we're going to use an IP address from our LAN segment connected to R1, which is on the 192.168.1 network. So we'll say IP address, and let's say 192.168.1.2 for the IP for the switch, followed by a Class C subnet mask. Let's do no shutdown to bring up this interface. Next, we're going to configure our default gateway to the local router on this network, which will be 192.168.1.1. Next, we'll configure a username and a password that we can use to log into our switch remotely. Our username will be admin, and our password will be Cisco123. Now, we will enable service password encryption that will apply encryption to all basic level passwords in our configuration file. Next, let's enable user-based authentication under our VTY interface for Telnet and SSH access. And next, we will configure our enable password for users to be authenticated when accessing the privilege mode. So we're going to do this using enable secret. And the password will be Cisco123. Now let's exit out the configuration. Now our configuration is done. Let's go through a couple of show commands on this switch. But first, we're going to plug in a computer into port number 12 on our switch. This will be used as part of our port security configuration in a different video. So let's do that now. So doing that, we see that it is coming up. Fast Ethernet 12, the port 12 is coming up, which is part of VLAN 1. So the VLAN 1 interface also comes up that we notice here. So let's start with one command, which would be show IP interface brief. So here we'll show the following. We can see the VLAN 1 interface that we configured with that IP address of 192.168.1.2, and that the status in protocol reflects an up-up status. And for port 12, that also reflects an up-up status since we plugged in our computer that will be used for port security. To view the MAC address table on the switch, it will be the command show MAC address table. Doing that will provide a list of all MAC addresses on the switch, followed by the type and the port that MAC address is associated to. So here you see that one of those entries that is connected to port number 12 is learned dynamically, and we see this MAC address, which is a part of VLAN 1. What this means is the device with the MAC address of 58B0 and other characters here is plugged into port number 12 on our switch. This is what the MAC address table provides. In a later video, we will configure port security for this host that is connected to port number 12. And instead of using the command show MAC address table, we can be very specific to look for a particular MAC address and to see what port is connected to. Let's say that you know the port number, but you do not know the MAC address of what is connected to that port, like Fast Ethernet 1012 or port 12. Well, we can use a different command that is part of the MAC address table command. So let's do that now. So that will be show interface. Oops, let's erase that. Wrong command. That'll be show MAC address interface, followed by the interface type, which is fast Ethernet, then the ID, which is 1012. And doing that, we will see the MAC address that is connected to that port of 1012. Let's go ahead and copy that right now. And another thing that we could do is, let's say, for example, that we just know the MAC address of the device, but not the switch port. Well, in that case, we can use the command show MAC address table address followed by the MAC address. That will show very similar results. So once again, this is the MAC address that will be used as part of our port security. So we'll be configuring port security on port number 12 on our 3750 switch.